Hello and welcome to the Project Hope podcast for families and friends with a loved one in a group of high demand, high control. I am your host, Jennifer. A lot has changed since I first started this podcast, so I thought I'd add a little to the initial introductions and provide something that's more up to date. I work with survivors of coercive control one-to-one. I also consult with families, and I offer education to the public around such topics. For the full scope of what I offer and also my credentials, you're welcome to check out my website, jennifer-french.com. I have a master's in the psychology of coercive control, and as of August 2024, I've been accepted into a PhD program called Psychology, Policy, and Law, and I'll have a specialty in either criminal behavior or forensic victimology. This will support the work that I currently do as an expert witness in cases involving coercive control. The Project Hope podcast has provided such an amazing opportunity for me to meet many wonderful people, survivors, experts, family members, and it's truly a pleasure to meet each one of these individuals you will hear from. This podcast will conclude with season 2 as I enter into my PhD program, but I have many other exciting things on the horizon, so please stay in touch and go to my website for any and all current events. Thanks to all of you who listen to Project Hope and care about this community. I initially met Marialicia Gonzalez 22 years ago at my first home birth with the midwife I became an apprentice for, fresh out of midwifery school. If you listen to my story, you will recognize her as the one who invited me to my first workshop on Mother Mary. To date, she is one of my very best friends and soul sisters. As you might imagine, we've been on quite a journey together. I'm thrilled to have her on the podcast, as this is a unique and new experience for me to host such a dear friend. A little about Madi and the amazing work she is engaged in. As the daughter of Cuban immigrants, Madi was raised in Miami and currently lives with her family in the Pacific Northwest. Her career has taken her from social worker to midwife to her current role as a registered nurse and grief revolutionary. After experiencing personal losses ranging from the deaths of dear friends, family members, relationships, experiences, and more, she has used her over 20 years in the medical field to develop courses and rituals that help integrate loss into life. A quote that I love from Madi is, "Our cultural stagnation and fear around grieving is a weakness, and I believe knowing and feeling what we grieve is one of the things that makes us strong." End quote. Madi is passionate about breaking down the social barriers around grief and the stigma attached to it. Over the last 2 decades, as a midwife, minister, and palliative care nurse, she has had the privilege of ushering hundreds through the passage of life and death. Madi is co-founder, curator, and editor of the Grief Rights Foundation, where art is used as agency to live boldly with grief. By curating monthly meetings, publishing articles, and facilitating workshops, Grief Rights creates the space for grief stories to be witnessed. Thank you for your amazing work, Madi. All pertinent links and information can be found in the podcast notes. Welcome, Marialicia Gonzalez. I am so grateful to have you on the Project Hope podcast with us today.
Yeah, it's totally my pleasure, Jen.
Yeah. So I know that today one of the things that we're going to be focused on is your story and experience within the Order of Christ Sophia, the group of high demand, high control that you and I were in together, and your transition of moving into another form of that environment called the Ruach Center,
Right.
and then your experience of leaving.
Right.
So I'll just leave that platform open to you and where you would like to launch off from.
Thank you. Yeah. So well, first of all, yes, I'm just so grateful to be on here with you. And I'm so grateful when I was thinking about getting to talk to you today and thinking about the longevity of our relationship, which now spans probably 20 years, I would say, pretty solid 20 years. And through all of that, because you and I met as midwives,
Yes.
we're, at different stages of our midwifery life, but met in this way. And you were my first recruit, my friend.
And you were my first teacher.
Right. And I was your first teacher. Yeah. You were my first recruit when I was a deacon minister. It was sort of interesting as I was thinking of that and just, getting to have this conversation with you. So I was thinking back to when you and I met and how alive and on fire I was with what was the Order of Christ Sophia. And then after you left, split into two orders, which remained one teacher who was Claire with the Order of Christ Sophia and another teacher, Peter, who went to the Ruach Center and split off. And, just thinking about, because whenever I've thought about how to explain to people the experience that I had as somebody leaving a group, it's hard for people to understand in the world who haven't been parts of groups of high control to understand why somebody would stay, why somebody, and even for me, right, where I was not married there, I didn't have children there, but often I describe it to people as having like an abusive relationship, like, sort of coming into a relationship with a certain understanding of what that relationship was going to be. And then having the control being increased in small increments over time, and the kind of the disappearance of your life as you know it, sort of fading into the background, sometimes gently, sometimes really dramatically, but that it's like it comes out of balance, it goes out of balance. And it's like, then the stakes are so high because the loss is going to be so great, so huge. And the loss being, one of my sisters after I left the order, and like I said, like I'm going to be using the word the order to sort of umbrella both of those orders, but then I can, we can differentiate if needed. But, she said, well, they took away your family when they took you from us originally. And then they took away your family when you left them and they shunned you. And then they took away your future family because then it was like I was in the order from the age of like 29 to 43. So they sort of not took, they took away like the options for me of my own family as I had always hoped and prayed during that time. So it was like this huge chunk of time that is a really key time in people's lives. Yeah. Right. And
thank you for just saying that piece, because it's so beautifully put in terms of understanding kind of the depth of the layers there.
Yeah. Yeah. And when people say like, oh, I did, but it was like, I did have children. I did have family there. I did wed the order, right? And I actually literally did. I took celibacy vows. I had a wedding ring. I ran the children's program for 8 years. I was part of raising, and I also had spiritual students who were my love. They were my heart. Like they were my family. And So yeah, I mean, there were times I described it like, it's like having a tsunami, like you leave your home and a tsunami comes and washes away the whole town you lived in, or like a fire just clears out the whole city and they're all gone. And then you're left standing and people are going, well, now you've got your life back. Okay. You know, like sort of, there's just no connection to the grief and the loss and the trauma and all of that. So anyway, I'm not sure exactly what.
No, that's okay. Yeah. So maybe just starting with, you know, where some of the pieces, like when did the fabric first start to have some tears in it, where you actually first started to go, something maybe doesn't feel right, or along those lines?
Yeah, thank you. So I came into the order around 1999, like 1999, 2000. And at that time I was a new midwife, and then I had a midwifery practice. And I remember that then I went back to nursing school to get a nursing license as well.
I remember
and during those years, so during those years, and the whole sort of motivation behind that was like that I was ordained a priest in 2002. So sort of like in terms of, like all the motivation around that was like, oh, that I could be mobile. Like, so I had a home birth midwifery practice. I was a certified professional midwife, and I had a very strong sort of communal, I had a very good reputation. I loved my work, and I had a very good connection in the community between the hospitals and other practices. And so, but it was a very, communal profession. So it's not easy to just get up and go and start that over. It's like your own practice. Mm. And so I remember thinking about that and going like, at that time there were centers sprouting all over the place. And I was like, oh, am I going to be able to move and be mobile? And because that was one of the things with the order, right? We were full-time doing the work there, but we were not financially at all supported. So you were still completely supporting yourself and the center because you were tithing. Yep. And we were also traveling all the time for all these retreats and all this stuff, but you were expected to completely support yourself. And so, and that was when I sort of, that I went into prayer and meditation around it, to look at like, what should I do? What could I do? And originally I thought about becoming a nurse midwife. And then that thought dropped for me because it just wasn't my culture of birthing. So it wasn't the right spot for me. But then I was like, okay, well, I can do something else in terms of nursing that then will help me be mobile. And during those years, while I was in an accelerated nursing program, I was running a full-time midwifery practice, including labor support and postpartum care, teaching childbirth classes. And I was also running a center with a priest that we never really got along. And there was a constant power struggle. And during that time, I was also running the children's program all those years. Like into like when I moved in 2007.
Basically 4 jobs.
Basically 4 full-time jobs, right? And basically the whole time as it started, like I was being told, I was never really a strong student in school. And so I needed extra help. And plus then I was, in my 30s, like it had been a long time since I had gone to school. Yeah. So I needed like my tutors at school. I had all these study groups and tutors and all these things. Plus so many times I would be studying and have a day to study. And then I'd get called to a birth.
Right.
And so then I'd have to leave. Anyway, it was a lot, and still expected to do meditation and communion every day, evening prayers every night, to be teaching classes every week. And then having this, like my primary relationship with this friend who was also a priest, be very, we just didn't get along. We just didn't get along. That's like the most basic way to say it, which is fine, but it wasn't fine, right? It was a constant source of distress. It was constantly being brought up to both of us as like, you know, almost being that we were almost out of alignment with God.
Yeah.
Because we could not get our relationship and our understanding. And there was constant like misunderstandings and all of this stuff. And that, I would say, was the beginning of the seeds of it. Because on top of that, with being told that I was never there enough, I was then being criticized that I was now spending too much time with the children's program and I was not wanting to be with the adults. And that I was like, you know, it was just all of this stuff like, which then in 2006, when I was, you know, invited to move to Oakland, to the center where you had been moved, you know, I was literally told it was my second chance. So I was literally told, this is your second chance, because I had failed so miserably and I'd been so consumed, you know, and at one point, Claire had said to me, you know, when I was in nursing school, struggling so hard because without all the other things I had going on, it would have been very hard. And she said to me, you know, Jesus and Mary wouldn't want you, you know, they might not want you to stay then in school if it's going to be such a hard and something you're always talking about. And it was like a threat, you know, and it was just like, so there was no room for the natural evolution of just feelings and fears and thoughts and like process.
Yeah.
And then I remember, you know, still when I was in Boston, where sometimes, you know, the Peter and Claire would come for workshops. And you had to be 100% available.
100%.
100% available to pick them up, to go eat with them, to celebrate them, to be taught by them, to listen to them, to, you know, all the things. And I remember Claire said to me, because it was like another workshop where they came and I got called to a birth because I was a full-time midwife, that she said, from now on, you have to be off call when we come. And I said, you know, do you realize, like, if and she would realize this because she had been a full-time midwife and a priest, and she had been running the order. And so these I would say were two of the big things for me, because I remember being at a retreat with her where she was leading evening prayers. So she was in the, you know, altar space, and her beeper went off and she stood up and she left to a birth. And so there she was saying to me, you have to have coverage when we come into town, because your lack of desire of being here is what's creating the fact that these babies are being born while we are here and you're getting called away. It's because it's showing me that you don't really want to be taught. Yeah. And I remember just feeling angry and distressed because I was financial, you know, I mean, I was in school, I was in an accelerated program, and I was running, you know, I mean, plus I was a healthcare professional. I had people relying on me. And anyway, you know, and the financial, just all the pieces, right?
Oh my gosh.
So those pieces, and then also the fact that things were changing where I wanted to have a family. When I came into the order, I mean, I remember Claire saying to me, I see that for you. I can see that, like, you know, and that I was like, yeah, me too. I know that for myself. Like, I want to have a family.
You had known that from a very young age.
Oh, since I was, 4, 3, whatever, as little can be. Yeah. Like that was a journey for me that I wanted and knew that was right for me. And they were supportive of that, except then that changed. As soon as I became a priest, the only sort of consideration of people who were an option for us were other priests. And as you know, I mean, when I became a priest, there were only like 5 of us or something, or 7 of us. And all there were only 2 male priests, and they were both married.
Yeah.
And there was another deacon coming up who later became your husband, you know, who was lovely. And I loved him, but he wasn't my partner. He was my brother. He was my friend, you know? And so that was stifling, you know? And so there were all these things that even when I think of, it was like this journey of I loved God. I loved serving as a priest, as a minister. I loved being in community and having that connectivity. And it was almost like that love at times eclipsed the loss.
Yeah.
But the loss was sitting there building up and building up and building up. And it didn't have the room to breathe or to say like, hey, this isn't right. Because as the order grew, because as you know, when I came into the order, it wasn't even the Order of Christ Sophia yet. It was the Holy Order of Sophia. It was Claire's women's order. And then it became the Order of Christ Sophia when they did. And then, you know, so it was like, so all of those pieces were like being siphoned away as they started demanding more control over our lives. But it was like, as they were doing that, it's like my devotion and my commitment had increased, and my loss of my regular life had just kind of fallen away. So it was like the perfect storm, you know?
Yeah.
And also, you know, in terms of my own responsibility around it, right? Like, I know that I'm a very devoted person. I'm a very loyal person. And in part, they're siphoning away the people in my life who would have been sounding boards for me, like my childhood or my college friends, like my parents, like my, you know, like them siphoning those people, it removed that. And because I felt very devotional to God and very serious about that, you know, I remember when I got ordained a priest, my dad said to me, are we ever going to see you again? Or is this going to be, and then my mom said, well, you know, I had a childhood friend who became a nun and lived in a convent, and we only would see her once every 7 years.
Yeah.
Because that was when it, and so they were like working out inside their minds of like how to categorize what I was doing so it could make sense to them, which is a very generous perspective, right? It's a very generous route.
Well, it is. And also with their history, they actually had a context for that.
Yeah, because they were, right. They had that. Yes. Yeah.
So many other families just have zero context at all, understanding what that looks like to
have like a spiritual life that is like 100% like you're secluded, but you're not secluded, because I was still working full time all the time. Like, and that was a part, I think, that for some people in my life, that they were like, oh, good. Well, you're still, you know, you're still a midwife. You still have because people knew like my passions and my love for working with people.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I think those were some of the things. It was the relationships that were being siphoned away. It was the fact that the rules weren't the same for us as they were for them.
Yeah.
And if anybody, Claire was the one who would know, because she had also, you know, she had been exactly like the kind of provider that I was. So she knew. And I had seen her many times leave. And so the rules didn't apply. And yeah, and then that piece of like, no give, you know, like there was just no give, like in, you know,
well, and the space that you talk about, the space to actually have your own intuition come up and voice that and move in that and bounce it off of others.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, right before I was going to move to Oakland from Boston, I remember had a long conversation with Claire. I was in tears because I was like, I don't want to move to Oakland. I don't want to live with Peter. I don't want to. I want, you know, and that I also said like, and this, I feel like I can hear people listening to this and going like, well, why did you, you know? And it's like, it's a good question. It's a good question. And the answer, at least that would be my question. But that I felt like I wasn't being honest in my service as a priest, because I was there largely still because I had all my community was there. Yeah. And I knew that if I chose to leave, I would lose everybody. And I didn't want to lose everybody in my community. I didn't want to lose those relationships. And I remember Claire said, like, well, sometimes that's what carries you, is the fact that you have these connections with people. And that is what keeps you. And it's not the relationship with God. And, you know, I wish I just would have gone like, that's not right, actually. Like, but
Well, and that piece for me to actually hear that is so completely a huge, huge miss to who you are and were and had been in terms of that devotion and love for God that, is so vibrant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really a shame, and at the time, and then I remember, I was, I shared with you that I've been kind of journaling a few things today, anticipating talking to you. And I was thinking about the peer pressure, that there was so much peer pressure. Like, I remember your call to me, your voicemail to me, that you said that you were calling me to talk about our news, which was I was moving to the center where you were.
Yeah.
And I remember also I had let the cat out of the bag by sharing it with people at school, who then somehow it got to one of our other sister priests. And anyway, people were I got a lot of shame. I got super shamed for that because Peter was actually trying to, quote, protect you, and help you to grow, you, literally you. I'm I don't know that we've ever even talked about that. Of course
I don't
not.
think so.
Yeah, that he was he didn't want me coming to be something where you stepped aside in your, quote, power. He wanted you to feel your own whatever, so that then when I came, we would be, because I had been your teacher and blah, blah, blah. And, and then that was a whole other thing when we got there. Yeah. When I got there. But, he was you know how they were. It was this is how the thing is controlling. Right. It's controlling.
Right. And this is what the new dynamic will be, that Jennifer is being raised up and you guys will be leading together as equals. And
right. And and it's so that was the other thing that was always really hard for me, right? Was navigating. And I would say that was also the tipping point on the 10 years later. No, well, it wasn't 10 years later. It was 8 years later, 7 years later when I left. But
the tipping point was,
well, when I left, still when you were there, as I was the first person ordained a master teacher other than Peter and Claire. Yep. So I had
for listeners that if it doesn't already sound very regal, it was the highest position that one could have in the organization.
Right. And it was, but yeah, so as priests, right? So then I went through this training and then I became a teacher. And then this is sort of jumping way ahead, but it was well, let me just to give listeners then the scaffolding, right? So there were different levels of ministers and different levels of students. And so as one rose from one, so if you came in as a student, but then you became a minister in training, well, then the demand, I was going to say the request, but it was the demand was that then your peers, your new peers are the ones that are at your same, quote, level, right? So you can't sort of tell your woes to the people that are below the level you are. So what became so that was deacon in training, minister in training, then deacon, then priest, then teacher in training, then master teacher. So the thing that became so challenging is while I was being initiated into the teacher life, Peter and Claire were becoming my peers. So all of what I was then learning about their relationship and I had nobody to discuss it with.
Yeah.
Because I could not speak to the priests. I couldn't even, and then, there was so much disturbance within the teachers, the training and people who left during the training. And that, it was just me with them.
Yeah.
And then when the orders, it's a whole other thing. I feel like it might be sounding confusing, but when the orders split and I did go with Peter to the Ruach Center, then he was raising up 2 other people to become teachers, one of which was the person who way back before we never got along.
Yeah.
So now he had put, it's like the classic way of creating animosity. I mean, countries do this.
Yeah.
You're higher than you, so you have to tell them what to do. Oh, now guess what? I just am flipping it. So I'm going to flip it. So now the one that was like, you were in power, now you have no power. Now this other person has power, or they have equal. Now you have to tell them everything. It's very,
So destabilizing.
it's destabilizing. It's just kind of wicked.
Yeah.
It's very divisive. Divisive is the word, that it's very divisive. The whole thing is.
That's such a good way to describe it. And, just to interject a little bit, I was actually thinking about this when you were speaking a little earlier about us. It's interesting because I had not thought about this, and it's actually not in my story of how I get in.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that was one of the very first, most bizarre actual experiences that I had was because we had met outside of this organization.
Right.
And I kind of fell in love with you immediately, felt an immediate kinship, as normal people do, and that happens. And then as I got into the organization, and now you were kind of my teacher,
Mm-hmm.
but I expected, as our listeners might, that looks like a relationship nowadays that one might have with a coach.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not diminishing your power in relationship to that coach.
Right.
And I remember interacting with you and all going, this is so weird. What just happened? Because I was trying to connect with you as my friend and I couldn't any longer.
Yeah. And I'm so sorry. And just say that to you. No, I really mean it.
I know you do.
Sorry, because it's like the behind the scenes was so much about like, well, now she's your student. Now you have to guide her. So now you have to like be in your power. I mean,
and I remember I was so confused that I actually asked you about it. And you explained it to me that way. You kind of said, well, now we have a different relationship because you have agreed to this type of relationship. And, I think, again, because of the mesmerization with the spiritual and wanting to grow and all of that, I kind of said, okay, I put my life in your hands and I've already loved you. So this must be okay. I trust you.
Oh my God.
Yeah. But that's how we did it.
That's how we did it. It's so strange, right? It's so strange. And I mean, look at us now, right? It's like, this is like a lot of journey to come through, but yeah. So I remember that conversation with Claire, and then driving cross country, staying with different people. And I just remember, I remember being in one of our very dear mutual friends' house, also a sister with us, also who is no longer there. And me like going like, I don't want to live with Peter. Like, I'm not interested, like, where people are like, oh, your growth is, you'll be so lucky, and it was a blessed time, right? There was a lot of blessings. You and I mean, thank God you were there. It was amazing at times, like very loving, very supportive, very connecting, and very just like, you and I are workers. Yeah. And we know how to work, and we work hard, and we're both very devotional. And so you and I just kind of got in there in those trenches, and we also really got along. Yeah. And we understood each other, which was like really refreshing for me, because when I came, I did have this like, what's wrong with me? Like because I couldn't get along with this other person for so long, that I was like, what is wrong with me? And them constantly trying to get me to like, and then coming and being with you, where you and I we just had a kinship that was different and easeful, even in our trials, like even in the harder parts. Yeah. And that was healing for sure, healing to my self-esteem and my understanding of myself,
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like the peer pressure, right? Like there was no room. If I had shared with the sister, brother, priests, like, I don't want to go. Like, I am actually going to figure out how to leave. They would have called, it would have been like a whole thing.
I actually wanted to just ask you about that because that's so surprising to me, just in terms of the group dynamic, of course, which, as is typical of cults with the leaders, that everybody's mesmerized by them. We're all in devotion to them. Any experience with them is considered a blessing, and you're so lucky. So it's very interesting to me. I didn't realize that you were able, just in your mind, to even detach enough to realize that you didn't want to be living with Peter. I am delighted to offer you Pure Haven products. All proceeds received go right back to the Project Hope podcast. I myself have been using these pure, safe, and toxin-free products for over 4 years, and I absolutely love knowing that my home has countertops that my little niece and nephew can eat off of without worrying that they have a handful of chemicals being placed in their mouths. The cleaning products are some of my favorites. The glass and surface cleaners smell amazing as well. So if this is of interest to you, please go to purehaven.com/Jennifer French. The link is also included below with information about this podcast segment.
Yeah, I didn't want to go.
And you just knew that. Did you know why?
I felt scared. I felt like I had just spent the last 3 years being told how bad I was and how much I was failing and how much I was just couldn't be good at relationing, and that I was paying too much attention to the kids, and that I was it was, it was all these things where I was and that's just with them coming every 6 weeks. I was
so now you were
going to live with this person? No, under this sort of, and so it was that kind of thing where I was but then, of course I felt like I should feel really, everybody going the people who had lived with their, it was all, it was all the things.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, that I would say those were reasons, right. That I, and that, and I think, Jen, looking back, right, there's certain things, even when I've shared with you about, the love there, right? That there was a lot of love, the relationships with people like you that I have, that we went through that and we came out all on our own in different directions with different experiences. It was real love and connection there, and certainly real spiritual experiences. But the damage wasn't the love. The damage is, for my experience and in my opinion, what was damaging to me was that the love was actually completely conditional.
Yeah.
It was, we're going to love you. We're going to teach you. We're going to connect with you only if you do these things. If you don't do these things, we're going to shun you, humiliate you, shame you, which I have to say that I also did to people, right? I was part of those conversations with people when they left. I was negative to people. I was verbally threatening, not physically, but sort of about people's souls, which is even worse to me. I mean, it's so I always have to face that in the experience that I had and the humiliation I went through is of course I went through that. Of course, Peter would never let me leave. I mean, Claire wouldn't either without humiliating me because that was the culture. That was the culture. And,
so it was. And just to add to that, I think you may have said this before, but to just be clear for listeners, it was a culture of shunning, that when somebody left, we no longer spoke with those people. And that was always an underlying threat. You knew that if you were making that decision, that you were completely gone, and you would never be able really ever again to speak to those people that you had developed these very deep and loving relationships with.
Yeah. Yeah. And so do you want me to talk about like my actual leaving?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think, I think also like what had been happening then in the few years leading up to, the split. So you left right before the split.
Yes.
Like with a year before. So I mean, you and I left like a year and a half difference.
Mm-hmm.
And, so what was happening for me during that time after I became a teacher and was really only Peter and Claire, sort of my peers-ish, that I was like, I learned very deeply how much animosity they had for one another and how dissonant their relationship was. And it became more and more dissonant inside of me that I really, what? Go ahead.
And just quickly, for the listeners to just understand the dynamic that we were in, these two were leading. They were, from our perspective, and certainly the priest's perspective and everyone's, they were in complete harmony, total tandem in everything that they were doing, because we functioned in this way where one would ask inner guidance, which was supposed to be asking pure God and God's self, and God would respond, and we would do whatever that initiation forward was. We would follow whatever we got. So Peter and Claire were the ones that deemed whether your guidance was right or wrong or slightly off or slightly on.
Mm-hmm.
And we always believed that the two of them, because their guidance was supposed to be perfect, that they would always be in alignment with their guidance, with one another. And maybe they would have some communication things, but surely they used all the amazing communication skills that they had taught us that are very common therapeutic, couples counseling type methodologies that we were all trained in. And we fully expected that behind the scenes, that's how they were functioning.
Right. 100%. And like, yeah. And just to be clear that they were not a couple, that they were not a romantic couple.
Good point.
Although later on I did just, that they did tell me that they had talked about that and that they were considering that. And Peter used to call Claire like what do you call it when like a woman scorned is a woman, whatever, like, when they were being more and more dissonant and Peter was thinking about leaving the order. Like all of a sudden, these things about Claire talking to me, crying about like how she never could go to a therapist or couldn't do anything because they were in this like experience where it was only the two of them, and all the dissonance about their relationship in relation to the order and how things should move forward. And those were things that were very shocking to me because of what you just said.
Yeah.
I mean, and how they presented, right? And what they demanded of us, they did not demand of themselves. And that was like over and over and over again. Right.
Wow. So now you're really behind the scenes.
Right. Now I'm in there with them. And then,
and by the way, nobody has ever been there with them before,
right,
as far as I know. Okay.
Right. I mean, one of the priests was being raised up as to be a teacher and then wasn't ordained. And then, like years before that, like a few years before me, but yeah, like, so nobody had sort of ever been in there, which, so it was that, like, then they started being divisive. Yeah. One, like, Claire would tell me things about like her experience of him, that she was just like overwhelmed and blah, 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 blah. And then Peter would tell me these things and that he believed, it was because she was like scorned because he didn't want her, that then she like was, it was this thing that they were just, and I again, today when I was contemplating our discussion, I was writing down and I had this memory of this time on the phone with them where they started arguing about whether or not there should be like whatever. It doesn't even matter. But they were arguing and arguing and arguing and arguing and arguing. And I remember, I'm a nurse. I was feeling my heart in my chest, and I like took my pulse was racing, and I was like, I had to go. Like I had to go to work. I was working full time. And I remember that after that, I sent them an email and I said, I'm glad to ask guidance with you on things. But if you guys need to talk something out, I'm not going to be there. Like I'm not going to be part of that anymore. Yeah. And then things really escalated from there before the split happened. And so many conversations that I had with both of them. And at that time, Peter had come to our center and went on like a little mini retreat with us.
Yeah.
And during that time, he and I spent hours and hours talking about stuff. And, he was like divulging all these things of their dissonance over the years and what he thought and all these things. And also things about telling me things that she had said about me, it was just divisive. Yeah. And it was painful. And, I was on the phone with him the night that he said like, okay, he asked me to ask guidance with him on whether he should leave.
Wow.
And, I did, and I got yes. Who the hell knows? Like, whatever. I mean, I think he should have left. I think we all should have left. The whole thing should have left, right? So who knows? God was like, I don't know what's going on. But
it was divine that
it was divine. No, but it was like, I think it's always interesting, right? Because I do believe in that prayer and meditation and connection with the divine. Yeah. And I think at that point, he was super unhappy.
Yeah.
And they were both unhappy. We were unhappy. Something needed to shift. So he sends a huge email to to everybody. And of course it's like a atomic bomb. Yeah. And then there was several days of people like choosing orders.
Yeah.
And then when I decided
to go to mommy or to choose daddy.
Yeah. And then when I decided to go with him, I knew that either one that I would decide to go with, when I would tell the other one, I knew they were going to just ream me out.
Yeah.
And of course, like they were like warm, loving, supportive, because also the students were, again, like I'm sort of this like in between.
Yeah.
Because and everybody's watching. And then they're like, why did you go there? Should I go there? Should I not go? All the things.
Right. That your decision as
that was going to be
the highest leader would matter to the rest of the organization.
Right. And maybe it did for some people and maybe it didn't.
Sure.
I think it probably did and didn't, right? Because people have their own. But and it was like that. My conversation with Claire, she called me like a traitor, that I was like trying to ruin the order and that I was being divisive, just like, your ex-husband. She gave me that. She gave me that, that honor of like, oh, truth teller. But anyway, so I did. I went with Peter, and then it was a year it was super hard. Like, so it was all these things like layer after layer after layer, because there was all this untangling, right? They had been an organization for so many years. There was all this untangling. And during that year, Peter was so unavailable for communication between them to, what people had properties, like, thank God. I didn't have any of that kind of stuff wound into the order, but people had their finances wound into it and their homes wound into it and their, all these things. And as everything was getting untangled, at first I was their mediator, and then I had to stop because it was impossible. But also Peter was refusing to have conversations about things. And then Claire, and I know that Claire and her group were doing all this healing work and forgiveness work. And I can't really speak to it because I wasn't there. Right. But that whole year was an attempt at reparation, an attempt at building something new with the Ruach Center. But I could feel in myself, like by that point, it was like, I don't know, Jen, it was so many years of not listening to myself and not having the room to listen to myself. And by that point, I had been, we were still in Oakland. And one of the things that was beginning to break the camel's back for me was this one day that I got, so these other two priests were already kind of in training for teacher status, whatever. And Peter sent us an email saying, would you please ask guidance whether the Oakland Center should close? And I will say to you, like, the four of us were heading out of the country for like a retreat.
Yeah.
Within like 3 days or something. And basically, I remember it was like a Saturday it was like a Saturday. It was a Saturday because I was working. I was a nurse and I was working that day. And I woke up that morning, I saw his email. And those kinds of emails weren't like, see if ask guidance. There was no room for it to be a no. He was already calling and going like he may as well just say, hey, the Oakland Center, we're closing it. Yeah. But instead it was this like, would you ask guidance of whether, and right. where should they go? Where should all the people in Oakland go?
Oh, wow.
I got guidance that we should go to Boulder. I was like, I think we should be in Boulder. But I also was like, not right away. It just felt like, oh, maybe there's this opening for shift. But of course, the other people got Chicago, where Peter was living, because of course, right? Well, then what started happening? So then it was like, immediately we have to close the center. So that Sunday, so it's a Saturday, I'm going to work. And he's basically telling me, like, I've just had vacation days because I'm going for like a week out of the country with them. The requirement was that I quit my job that day. Oh my gosh. And I have to tell my community that afternoon, after I get home from my full work. I remember we went out to dinner and it was this like, we're closing the center because it's like, at this point there had been so much. I mean, this is a whole other story about with Peter and whatever, with aliens and like connecting to the aliens. I mean, I'm serious. Like it was a real thing that I was being shamed for because I wasn't on board, because I remember being with the two others and Peter where they were all like connecting to these aliens and what are the alien like, and that with Jesus and Mary and this thing. And I was like, I just like Jesus and Mary. I don't want to connect with any other like it was just not my thing. And there was no room for that, of course, right? Wow. And so that was sort of the beginning of the end for me, because that next day I had to give a sermon closing. That was going to be our last Sunday. Can you imagine? Is people are coming and I'm just like, okay, now this is what we're doing. This is what God has told us. And I mean, as I'm telling you this, I'm like, I did that.
Yeah. Right. And you also did it within this mindset where everything was laid out and there was a bubble that you were in of expectations that you had to fall in line with.
Yeah.
No, otherwise,
or else what ended up happening later would have happened. Which was like, and so, I mean, my community, they accepted it and they were
I was just going to say,
so much grief.
The trust and the love of those that we were serving, that I can imagine that they really just trusted you and went with it.
Well, no, and people were shocked and scared and all the things, right? But it was, Peter had been talking about like the giant earthquakes that were coming and that we were living on a fault line and that the like oceans were going to come in and that the like, it was time to move everybody into like the center of the country and get everybody off the coasts. And the alien thing. And I don't even remember exactly what the alien thing was. I just remember I didn't like it at all.
I'm refraining from trying to ask about the alien thing because
I don't even know what it was. I don't remember, but I just remember him being like, all right, let's connect with it. And I was like, it felt freaky to me. I just was like, I don't want to, but anyway.
So then you're queued up to go on this trip.
So that afternoon, I had been working for this company for 5 years. They had always let me go on every trip, every time, for every retreat. And I'm like, I'm just going like, I'm quitting. Yeah, we were leaving Tuesday. So I remember that Monday, I went into that office.
Oh, gosh.
To tell them, or like to talk to them. And I was just in tears. I was like, it was a shock. And that's a whole other story for the after. Because we were we were Christian, I can't even say the word. They were so loving and calm with me. They had every right to be like, whatever. I don't know what they had a right to do. But they were human. They were people. They were caring about me and what I was going through. Anyway, we went to Japan. I wasn't really going to say Japan, but oh, well, I just said Japan. We went out of the country, went to Japan now that I said it. And that, however long we were there, I had my own room. The other two priests that were in training had a room together, and then Peter had his own room. And that trip was horrible. Like every day, every night, I would pack up my things. And I would go I remember I didn't have any debt because I didn't have any debt, and I had a credit card. And I remember I was like, when we go to sleep, I would pack up my bags and I would be like, okay, I'm going to just leave. I'm going to get on a plane. It doesn't matter how much, I was just like, I've got a credit card, a good one. I'm going to leave. And then I was like, how am I going to do it? How am I going to leave? I could have, right? I could have, I had my passport, but it was I remember, it was just.
And can I ask what your mentality was when you were doing that or thinking of leaving? Was it, what was
it was just so many things had built, or so many things had stacked up.
Okay.
And then now it was it started to be, okay, so then this is where the storyline started, where Peter started telling me that during my years after you left and after he left, you left to move to another place to start the center with your then husband. And he left to start the Chicago center. And I was left running the center and running the novice program and all of that. He started saying that I had been running the center always just selfishly, that it was about me, that I was having all the students serve me, not Jesus, Mary, not God, that I was having them love me and having to do for me. And he was just, and so he started on that. And then the others were also trying to you know how it was. If one of them, if Peter or Claire got on a track, then everyone had to line up on that track and then keep pushing that person. Yeah. And, that it was all sorts of things about then I was just not relaxed there. I was having a horrible time. I was really stressed out because every day I wanted to leave. And then he would have these really warm conversations with me personally, in his room, where he would just be just kind and warm as he could totally be.
Yeah.
And then the other two would come and he would just start laying in on me or and then after that, and again, leading up to that, there had just been experiences where I just was this isn't right. Even what we had just done, taking down that whole center, it wasn't right by people to do that.
Yeah.
It was so irresponsible of the level of trust that people had in us.
Yeah.
And including us in him, right? It's and so after that, it was our whole center was packed up in that time we were gone. And we ended up going back to Chicago. And it was even that because I had a ticket. I don't know. I had a ticket because I had a ticket all the way to San Francisco, because that's where I had flown out of.
Yeah.
And I was like, so even on the plane back, I remember standing in the bathroom, that I was like, okay, here's when I'm going to go. I'm just going to go like, goodbye. You guys keep going. I'm going to stay I was staying in San Francisco because it was San Francisco and then going further in to Chicago. And it was like on the plane talking to him, weeping like this isn't. And I know that I'm not actually even being clear as to why. It was like, again, like all of what had been wrong was so stacked up in me. And then now I was being accused of having been this selfish, not loving priest. And I was being told like, this is what I was doing. And I was also being told and threatened that if I decided to leave or to continue this sort of way of being that I couldn't even figure out what I was doing because I wasn't doing it, was that he would tell everybody. He would tell the ministers. He would tell all my students. He would tell the community. So it was like, I was like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And so we went back, and then there was another retreat happening, like a all people, everybody retreat. And during that retreat, he basically had me tell all the ministers that I had used my time in Oakland for myself selfishly, that I had, just all of this. And people, some of my former students who were like, were just like hurt, mad, sad. Then people, again, everybody just got in line.
And this is so amazing. I mean, just thinking of our listeners as well to really understand that you knew that that was not what you were doing because you obviously were caring for the community.
But I think I did leave space.
Yes.
Obviously, because the other training that we had was to always put their word ahead of ours. Right. So even though I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about, it was like, oh, I must have been doing this thing, but I'm unconscious of it. That's where the darkness is, or that's where my blind side is,
Right. And that's actually what I wanted to kind of draw out, is that if there's any glimmer of truth, then it was so easy to manipulate us to bring out whatever that glimmer, like maybe the one time that you selfishly did something that you were half conscious of, that, it's like, then you just get on board with what that teacher wisdom is telling you about yourself.
Yeah.
And you claim it.
Yeah.
And it is a truly amazing phenomenon, the power of that coercive control.
Yeah. I mean, and when I think about it, I go, yeah, at that point I had been there for like 13 years, 14 years. Like, even though, yes, I went into it as an adult, I also, I want to say that like, there are things that when I've looked back, now it's been 7.5 years since I left, right? I have a very different life now, very integrated life, that when I look back, I see the places of my youth. I see the places of the way I was parented, or the family dynamics that were a part, or just parts of my personality that like allowed me to step in. Because when I even think back, Jen, like students I had along the way that were like, I want to have a family. I want to be able to have different relationships, or I want to like, or I'm, they were like saying that like, being gay was not something like that wasn't real for a while, that people were like, but I am gay. So I'm going to be like, like these things that it's like, when I look back and I go like, these things that it's so, just so divisive and it's just like the root of negativity, and also the harm is huge. Like it's like I'm trying not to use these awful words but at the same time it's just like this wickedness. I've never even used that word. It's not one of my words, but that word keeps coming up because it is a place where, people who are like seeking power that are really smart. Like they're smart. Both of them were really smart. They're psychologists. They had that background and they utilized it, for their benefit and for others' benefit at times. And so yeah, just to mean like things started getting so challenging because my desire to leave and my feeling like I was done was increasing and increasing. And all the while I was being, I kept being told like I had, that I had this darkness, that I needed to be, as you can remember the words, like retrained as a priest, that, when we got to Chicago and moving in there and all the things I'm trying to think. Oh, I know what happened. We were in Chicago, but there's still like the house needed to be packed up in Oakland. And I said I would go to pack it up with a few people that were in Oakland. So it had been like packed up, but it needed to be put in a truck. And there was a student from Chicago that was like going to go with me. And this had been after like, should I stay? Should I go? Should I stay? Should I go? Okay, I'm going to stay. But then I decided, okay, I'm going to go to Oakland to do this thing. And I knew when I was saying goodbye to people, I was like, I'm done. And on the plane, I sent Peter an email saying I was done. And at this point, I had not told my family, I hadn't told my family, I hadn't told anybody because I did not have I didn't know what my family's response would be. And I also just didn't have it in me to be able to manage what people's questions would be, which fair questions, but I didn't have it. Yeah. But just to go like sort of sequentially through, it was like, I did that. I got back, really intense emails from him and a few other of the priests. And then I ended up, students were calling me. Everybody was calling me to try and get me to go back. Friends of ours, who had left and come back calling. And I was devastated. And I ended up staying at somebody's house who she is a deacon. Oh, yeah. And she was really so compassionate, so loving, just so open. Like, you can stay here as long as you want, which is very out of the ordinary, but she's a very unique, amazing person. Mm-hmm. And then she was forced to kick me out of her house. Yeah. So on the last 2 nights that I was there, we had packed up the truck and the truck was on its way. She was told that she needed to tell me that I couldn't stay there any longer. Yeah. And then I said, well, I understood how hard it was for her to say that to me and then I said, okay, well, I'll go to the house. I'll just sleep. I knew there was a mattress still there. My mattress was there. And she said, no, you can't. Oh my God. And I was like, okay. So I just went to a hotel, which in part was really nice to just get out of there. But then getting back to Chicago, as you can imagine, everybody was now, I was like a student, like a short, so I ended up going back, and then I was going to try. I was like, okay, let me try to come back. And It was 2 weeks. So it was like, I decided to leave. I kind of got convinced to try. And I went back to Chicago for 2 weeks. I had to go back anyway to pick up my things. Yeah. But I ended up going for 2 weeks. And those 2 weeks were, again, it's like sometimes it's still hard for me to not go like I deserved it because of the part that I played in other people's departures, making them harder for them you know, including yours. I remember talking to you the night that after, you know, like not that I was, but that I was just like beckoning you to stay. Like I was never trusting people's own knowing, even though my only job was to help connect people to God and to their own knowing. I still was never, so it was weak. It was weak in that way. Right. And so,
and it was also learned, and it was
the
only paradigm in which we were allowed to think and function.
Totally. So for the following 2 weeks, I was, you know, I would say subjected to, you know, the humiliation and the shame, being in that big room that, you know, the big classroom, that like giant room in Chicago, having Peter tell people like all these things that were based, like just lies about me. I mean, I don't even remember him like talking about like what I did, and students being like, well, why did she do that? And me just having to sit there and listen and be like, there was nothing I could say. And then going into the small groups with the priests and having all the priests say things to me, and like, and then it's like became like a witch hunt. Like I always remember this moment where Peter was like, and you would have like Gloria making you like your smoothies in the morning with extra ice. Like this whole thing where I just was like, yeah, I worked full time. I ran a center. I did communion meditation every day. I did classes like 6 days a week. Yeah, that I wasn't also cooking and also doing, and that like one of my students would make me a smoothie so I could like eat and get out to go to my full-time job. Was that me being serviced, or was that me being supported to be of service? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, but it was like those kinds of things where I also was like, Peter, does everyone here know your favorite food? Does everyone know exactly what you eat and how you like it and how to serve it to you? Do you know? And so it was this, but I couldn't say that to him, you know, and I'll tell you, even right now, me telling you this story, I can still feel inside of me these places that pull back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mostly because this is a public forum and I don't know who's going to hear it.
Yeah.
And it's vulnerable. I mean, I guess what I'm feeling is vulnerability, right? Really deep vulnerability of like, this really happened. Like that kind of shame, blame, and attack.
Yeah.
Where the only option was to agree.
Yeah.
And so then, you know, it was day after day after day after day. And I just didn't know what to do. I felt kind of like a caged animal. And I would be talking to Peter on the phone and be packing up my things. And then he would like convince me to stay. And then he would like berate me in front of everybody. And then everybody would look at me like, you know, the whatever, you know.
Yeah.
The black sheep. And then nobody was talking. You know, it was really terrifying. It was terrifying. And I honestly felt like I was going to lose my mind because I was
abusive.
Yeah. I was like disassociate. I was like, who they're saying I am is not who I am, but I'm losing power. It was like stones being put on me and put on me and put on me and put on me while they're going, we're not putting stones on you. You're the stone.
Yeah.
You know, it was like, and so then Peter said, you know, he was like, okay, your last chance is to go do a 3-day seclusion, but I couldn't do it there. Which again was like a blessing, even though it was like ridiculous. So I just drove to some town in Illinois, got a hotel, and I prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed. And then I just started I reached out to my sister and she remembers the text. I didn't ever remember what I said, but my sister who lives in Portland and that I said, like, I've left the order and like, is Portland an option, you know, for me to come? So I was like either going to move to Portland or Boulder. I don't know. I just felt like Boulder was a place that was calling me and she said yes. And so I kind of planned I told Peter and the other priests that I was going to leave and I was going to come in the morning and pick up my things. And he wrote me some brutal emails saying, I wish I actually had queued them up so I could read some of the things.
Yeah.
Honestly, because I think if people are listening who don't have these experiences,
yeah,
it's really hard to understand.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard. I mean, although maybe it's not, I don't know,
I think it is really hard because unless you've actually had this experience, and then I agree with you, to actually hear the words and hear the intensity, and to also feel how we would stay within that dynamic or not, it's pretty incredible. But I'm so appreciative actually of the way that you described things, and also just that your experience of the gaslighting, how you described like just your world kind of crushing in and you can't even make sense anymore, and sort of the disassociation. I'm so glad that you actually went into describing that, because that is what so many people experience at the end there, that excruciating, or somewhere along the path, and then staying, but that excruciating, not even quite knowing who you are anymore without that. It's incredible.
And I should say, I mean, at that point, I was estranged from my family for like 10 years, like a decade, where I had seen my parents twice for like a tiny amounts of time. And I had a family member who's still there, there. And, I always like wish that because at that point they were very like, what's going on? Like, why are, what are you doing? Like, what's happening? And that I wish I would have been like, just come with me and then we can work it out. Like, we'll figure it out. But like, but again, like I wasn't trusting I was like, I was partly believing what they were saying about me and kind of just going, but what I knew, and I kept thinking back to you. And when one of our people who left and came back and now is still there, had sort of gone through a mental break, that you were the one to take her, like to take them to like hospital or whatever. Cause I remember going like, I think I'm going to have a mental break and nobody here is going to care. Like they're going to let me die.
Wow.
Even though they're going to let me die, or they're going to like beat me down as I'm going down. Cause that's what they were doing. Right. Wow. And so, I told them I was leaving and I was going to drive over there and pick up. I mean, I just had a car and I was like going to just put whatever I could put in my car.
Yeah.
And I remember I pulled in and Peter was like working in something and there were people in the house because I could see people's cars. And and I, for the next like 2 hours, I packed my stuff and went down and like packed up my car and threw whatever I could else like in the garbage. And Peter, he didn't even say hello or goodbye to me. He just looked at me and like scornfully and walked away. For people who don't understand, if there's people here that are listening that are not privy to the inner worlds or have people that are in groups of high control that they love, thinking of it like an abusive relationship that starts out with a certain agreement, but over time incrementally changes. Yeah. That's why when a person comes out of it, they can't just spring back into any, that there's a lot of like work and healing and sadness and grief to go through, so anyway.
Yeah. And thank you I'm so looking forward also to our next conversation, because I feel like we have been on a grief journey together.
So much.
A healing journey together. And that process looks so different and far and wide for different people, but I'm so appreciating that you're going to share that as well, because I think that's, that's a part that people are definitely interested in, because it's sort of our resurrection,
Yeah. It's the rising, right? It's the rising and what we do with that. And grief. Yeah. Grief is, I'm passionate about grief and bringing that into our culture as a norm. I think the grief that we've experienced and what we've done with it, like you doing this, right? Like giving to the families that were like your family and my family continues to, because we still have somebody in that group. And,
well, sister, I love you
so much. I love you so much. And I'm so grateful for you a million times over. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of my story and your heart and your mind and your audience.
Thank you so much.
Love you.
Love you. Yay! For the podcast outro today, in relation to Madi's story, I thought I'd address just one fundamental dynamic and principle that takes place in both extremist groups and abusive or controlling relationships: the double bind. The Oxford Dictionary defines this as a situation in which a person is confronted with two irreconcilable demands or a choice between two undesirable courses of action. The double bind theory was first described by Gregory Bateson and his colleagues in the 1950s. Double binds are often utilized as a form of control without open coercion. The use of confusion makes them difficult both to respond to and to resist. So let me describe this within the context of the most foundational principle upon which the group and leadership that Madi and I were a part of functioned. What I'm about to say about Peter also applied to Claire Watts when I knew her. As you heard in Madi's story, when the group divided and the leaders split, she went with Peter. Peter Bowes is still functioning as of February 2021, having recently moved everyone in what he has named Ruach Center to Knoxville, Tennessee. This group is also registered legally as Inner Path Center Incorporated, so they can continue with tax-exempt status and receive all the benefits that affords them. Peter not only told us he was completely connected within to God, could directly hear the voice of God, and was therefore above each one of us in wisdom and truth. He also went so far as to claim that he was the reincarnated disciple of Jesus, named Peter, the head of the church, here on the earth at this time for a specific and world-changing mission. I could say more, as this is not the comprehensive list of esteemed titles he gave himself, but you probably get the picture, so I'll leave it there. Because of these claims, he could say whatever he wanted. He could advise each of us exactly as he wanted. And if we were not aligned with his perspective, we were automatically placed in a mindset where there was no way out. But he was beautiful in how he presented this. He'd be soft and loving. He'd be kind and seemingly filled with humility, almost embarrassed that it would be revealed who he truly was, Peter, the high disciple. He'd set us free over and over, stating that we didn't have to listen, we didn't have to do what he said. Everyone and anyone was free to come and go as they pleased. But how were we to reconcile not listening to someone directly connected, perfectly connected to the voice of God? If my inner guidance was different from his, mine had to be wrong. And slowly but surely, this just became my foundation, unquestioned and solid, so that my only choice became how to get aligned with Peter, with God, with God's will for me. And so perhaps you can begin to understand just one facet of why Madi might waver back and forth about leaving the group, the same way that a woman abused by her lover typically leaves 7 times before finally leaving the relationship for good. How difficult might it be to leave if doing so means that you essentially no longer want help from someone who represents the clarity of God, especially when something is wrong with you. This person has the answers and surely is your only hope at redemption. Often, by the time someone wants to leave or is secretly thinking of leaving, the double bind phenomenon has created a contained argument within one's own mind that traps them from thinking outside the box. In Madi's case, you hear her express that at her time of leaving, she thought she was bad. Can you imagine the strength and fortitude it would take to leave when it means you've failed the entire point of your mission, your personal evolution, everything you bought into, all that you've been devoted to and living for so many years? She wasn't just leaving everything she'd known, going into the unknown, but it would take some time before the double-bind clouds parted and she could see clearly that she was being manipulated and abused in the deepest places of all, the psyche and the heart. Do you know that in my master's program for the psychology of coercive control, when we learned about the double bind from a recovery perspective, we use approaches that are established from psychologists' work with what was at the time labeled as schizophrenic individuals. While I have issues with this term, I use it now only because it still generally describes a certain level of disconnection from reality. Bateson, who first described the double bind theory, wrote that, quote, "The ability to communicate about communication, to comment upon the meaningful actions of oneself and others, is essential for successful social intercourse." End quote. So, authentic communication is blocked in a double bind situation. You can't do right for doing wrong. In this situation, the person will learn to distrust their own sensory awareness in favor of the other's assessment of the situation. It's very similar to gaslighting, where one distrusts their own mental capacities. The operational component of the double bind is its pattern of disqualification, the means by which one person's experience is invalidated as a result of the imposed bind. So you see, the double bind is an incredible principle, an incredible eye-opener when you understand it. In the same way, for those who are listening from the perspective of being a family member or friend with a loved one in such a group with extreme beliefs, I have for years repeated to you all that truly your hands are tied with this group. Peter has told all of his people that their parents are controlling, overbearing, that in fact it is right that people break from their bio families. Once again, a little truth that developmentally we all need to break from parents as we ourselves grow and individuate. Yes, this is normal for all healthy individuals. But as far as I know, present day, there is not one individual in his group that is in relationship with anyone else outside of that group. Family members' experiences, missing their loved one and wanting to connect, is invalidated by Peter's message that the family is controlling and dominating, leaving the loved one unable to understand that the actions families take are out of love. Since Peter has coached his followers to clearly cut off familial ties, This leaves the families who have been rejected and told to not contact their loved one as the accused in the minds of the loved one, and therefore unable to get through or take any action without being seen as controlling or aggressive or going directly and explicitly against the loved one's wishes. If the party line remains as it was when I was there, then parents who try or retry to connect with their loved one are not listening or respecting their adult child's wishes. They are viewed as aggressive and controlling when in fact it is Peter that has aggressively controlled, all the while making it seem loving, holy, of pure intent, and God's will. For my participation in this, I am truly sorry. And once again, I so hope that this podcast can help shed some light and insight into these dynamics that can be so challenging to understand and can bring such tremendous pain and confusion to those who care about people in such a scenario. I thank Madi for sharing such intimate details about a time that was so twisted and destructive. As is the case with each one who is shared on this podcast, I thank you for sharing your stories culled from the fires of pain and for your courage to choose freedom, to choose you. Stay tuned for another episode of the Project Hope podcast when Madi shares her healing journey from having left the Ruach Center to present day. I appreciate her willingness to share the ups and downs of her life. By her story, you will see that healing is a journey, and she has employed varieties of resources along the way that have led to the fullness of the life she now lives. My heart is with you, Project Hope podcast listeners. Always feel free to reach out, comment on the pod, subscribe, forward to anyone you think this might help, and think critically, take heart, and be free. Thank you.